Thanks for coming along tonight, folks, on this warm Sydney night to hear the Honourable David Coleman MP, who makes a welcome return to the Sydney Institute. I think it's your third visit here, and you're very welcome. Talking on the topics of values first, Australia in the world, but I'll introduce him briefly. The member for Bank since 2013. He held ministerial positions in the Turnbull and Morrison coalition governments. His background is in business, in particular in the media, and in recent times he's been appointed to the very significant position of Shadow Minister for Foreign Affairs. And as I said, the topic, values first, Australia in the world, is one of Mr. Coleman's first major addresses as a Shadow Minister of a very important portfolio. So you're very welcome, and thanks.
Well, thanks, Gerard, and thank you for inviting me along tonight. Much appreciated. And as Gerard said, this is the third time that I have addressed the Institute, and each time I've greatly appreciated the opportunity to speak in this important forum. And I think we can all agree that there is a lot to talk about. And while commentators will commentate, the role of government is altogether different. What matters in government is moral clarity, knowing who you are and what you stand for, and knowing how to put your values into action. And if that's true of political leadership in general, it's especially true of foreign affairs. Stay focused on the big things. See through the noise. Think about 20 years from now, at least as much as you think about next week. So in that context, here's what we know. We know that democratic and economic freedom are the greatest forces for good in human history. Absent them, ordinary people suffer. We know that democratic and economic freedom are not guaranteed. They must be defended. And we know that Australia is a very special place. We aren't perfect, but we are more perfect than anywhere else on earth. Whether in domestic or foreign policy, our challenge is the same: defend and enhance the Australian way of life. Ensure that our children inherit a nation that continues to be the envy of the world. Ensure that our democratic and economic freedoms are maintained and enhanced so that every Australian can be their true and best selves. It is a weighty task, and addressing it starts with national security. When Prime Minister Howard invoked the ANZUS Treaty after September 11, he brought to life our most important and solemn compact. Without hesitation, he activated the treaty, pledging our support to America after that most horrific of days. We were reminded then that this alliance is at the very core of our national security, and that remains the case today. When in government, the coalition built on the foundations of ANZUS with AUKUS. This partnership between Australia, the United Kingdom and the United States is historic. AUKUS is about a free and open Indo-Pacific that is secure and stable. In obtaining nuclear-powered submarines, we will be substantially aiding the defence of our nation. It wouldn't have been possible without the coalition government's commitment to boosting both our sovereign shipbuilding capabilities and our defence spending. Through ANZUS, AUKUS and cooperation in so many other areas, the United States relationship is pivotal to Australia. Recently, there's been no shortage of criticism of the US. But the fact is that the United States remains the world's most powerful nation and a beacon of hope across the earth. When Secretary of State Madeleine Albright described the United States as the indispensable nation in 1998, some people scoffed. What about this issue or that? What about the times that the US had not lived up to its values? True enough. But Secretary Albright had a point. It was the United States that led the world to defeat the evils of fascism and communism. It was the United States that came to Australia's aid in the Coral Sea in 1942. It was the United States that secured Europe after World War II. It was the United States that unleashed the power of free markets around the world, helping to grow living standards to levels that are unprecedented in history. Consider the counterfactual. Imagine there was no United States in the 20th century. What happens then? There's been much coverage in recent times of President Trump's request that other nations do more to contribute to international security. It is an understandable request. The US has made enormous contributions to global security over many decades. Asking others to share more of the burden is hardly unreasonable. We in the Coalition strongly believe that Australia must increase its defence investment. When Labor was last in government, we were alarmed to see defence spending drop to a record low 1.56% of GDP, the lowest level since World War II. This was inexcusable. The first responsibility of government is to provide for the defence of the nation. Labor failed to do that. Under the Coalition, defence spending increased to more than 2% of GDP. With Labor now back in office, we've seen more than $80 billion in defence cuts and deferrals, and the government is already walking away from their commitment just 12 months ago to increase defence spending to 2.4% of GDP. By 2033-34, many years away, Labor now says that defence spending will still be just 2.33% of GDP. The truth is that Labor cannot be believed on defence. We need more money invested in defence now, not years from now. And of course, it is not simply about just investing more money. It is about committing investment to the most important areas, the areas that would make the most difference in the event of armed conflict. This week, we announced that a coalition government would provide an initial $3 billion of additional funding to reinstate the acquisition of the F-35 squadron, which Labor cancelled in their 2024-25 budget. And we will have more to say on defence investment prior to the election. Increasing defence spending and sharpening its focus is not only important in the context of our US alliance, it is fundamental to ensuring that Australia stands on its own 2 feet in an increasingly dangerous world. We're in strong agreement with the United States on the need to increase defence investment. But of course, we won't always agree with the US, and sometimes we'll need to say so publicly. Australians know that Peter Dutton will always stand up for our national interests, no matter what. We unequivocally back Ukraine and President Zelensky in their war against the murderous Putin regime. And we want to see fewer barriers to trade, not more, because more economic freedom means higher standards of living. We expect the Labor government to succeed in its efforts to secure an exemption on US tariffs for steel and aluminium. After all, the Coalition secured the same exemption in 2018. And the arguments in favour of an exemption are even stronger today than they were in 2018. The US enjoys a substantial trade surplus with Australia, and of course we're investing heavily in US defence industry through AUKUS. We hope the Prime Minister succeeds in securing an exemption because Australia needs him to. I said before that Australia is a very special place. A big part of the reason why is our embrace of economic and democratic freedom. But that is not the only reason. We are a decent nation. We have strong values. We are not boastful. We don't tell everyone how great we are, but we know we are great. Perhaps the simplest metric that proves this is that every year there are far more people who want to come to Australia than who want to leave. We've stood on the right side of history's most important battles. We are respected around the world. That respect is our superpower. But Foreign Minister Penny Wong has trashed that respect and our values on the international stage. When the history of the Albanese government is written, whenever that is, Minister Wong's conduct in relation to the Middle East will be remembered as a shameful episode. Now, we are a long way away, and our direct influence on the conflict in the Middle East is limited. There, our most precious asset is not money or materials, but our voice. We must stand up for democratic values, and we must stand up for democracies that are under attack. Hamas's strategy in the barbaric October 7 attacks was clear. Murder as many Israelis as possible. Place military targets next to civilians, innocent civilians, in Gaza. Hope that large numbers of innocent Palestinians would be killed and wounded. Hope that weak governments would respond to this by isolating Israel. It's hard to conceive of a more evil strategy. Hamas not only wanted innocent Israelis to die, it wanted innocent Palestinians to die in the largest possible numbers. Mature leadership is about never, ever caving in to such tactics. Could history be clearer on this point? If you do what the aggressor wants, the aggressor does more. But Labor has done what the aggressor wanted. They have abandoned Israel, our long-standing democratic ally in the Middle East. Minister Wong uses diplomatic doublespeak to try to obscure the bankruptcy of the government's position on the Middle East. She says that the government now supports Palestinian recognition without any negotiation with Israel. But then she tries to obfuscate by suggesting that a two-state solution will come at some later time with various conditions attached. But once you recognise Palestine, you have two states. No amount of misdirection from Penny Wong can obscure the fact that 1 + 1 still equals 2. And how can you recognise Palestine if there has been no agreement on its borders? You can't, unless you don't care what Israel thinks. Having shamefully abandoned Israel to secure inner-city seats against the Greens, Minister Wong then says Australia has had a bipartisan position on a two-state solution for 20 years. The best response to that is, that was true until you came along. The coalition supports a two-state solution, but only one that is negotiated between the parties. Minister Wong has behaved like a factional boss, desperate to cling on to under-threat Labor electorates. The goal has been to fend off the Greens' political threat through the overt and public abandonment of Israel. The lesson for Hamas is clear. Create the right kind of domestic political pressure and Australia will cave in. It is disgraceful. If elected, a Dutton coalition government will revert to Australia's previously long-standing positions on UN votes regarding Israel, rejecting Labor's recent unilateral changes, which have been made purely for domestic political reasons. Minister Wong's treatment of our democratic ally was also on display in her conduct related to the capital of Israel. If the minister had deliberately set out to offend Israel, she could hardly have done a better job. In declaring that Australia would reverse Australia's recognition of West Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, Penny Wong managed to do a number of things. Firstly, deny to media and Jewish groups that there was any change, then 24 hours later rush through a cabinet decision and announce this major reversal of Australian foreign policy. Secondly, make the announcement during the Jewish festival of Simchat Torah in the midst of Israel's election campaign. Thirdly, win the praise of Hamas and Palestinian jihad. And finally, draw strong condemnation from the Prime Minister of Israel. Now, Australian Jewish community groups were shocked at both the lack of consultation on the decision and its substance. The decision also betrayed the statement of then Shadow Minister Mark Dreyfus just prior to the 2022 election, when he attacked the coalition for suggesting there were any differences in policies between the parties on Israel. When Labor announced its shambolic decision in 2022, the coalition expressed its strong opposition and affirmed that our position remained that West Jerusalem is the capital of Israel. This continues to be our position. And as we also made clear at the time, if elected, we will not repeat Labor's diabolical failure of process on this issue. Instead, we will conduct an orderly and professional consultation process, including discussions with local community groups, our agencies, and Israel's government. The Albanese government has also compromised our values in continuing to provide taxpayer funds to the disgraced aid organisation UNRWA. In August last year, UNRWA sacked 9 employees on suspicion of being involved in the October 7 atrocities. But incredibly, there appears to have been no consequence for these 9 people other than losing their jobs. No prosecution, seemingly not even a referral for prosecution. Australia, under this Labor government, is giving $20 million each year to UNRWA. And Minister Wong has not made that funding contingent on any action being taken against these alleged terrorists. Think about that. The government is transferring the hard-earned money of Australians to an organisation that appears to not be seeking criminal prosecution of people allegedly involved in October 7. Imagine if an Australian employer discovered that 9 of its employees had apparently been involved in a terrorist attack. And imagine further, the employee just said, 2 weeks' notice, you've lost your job, no further consequences. That is what UNRWA appears to have done. And Australia continues to fund it under Mr Albanese. It is extraordinary and it betrays our values. The people of Gaza need humanitarian aid, and the coalition strongly supports the provision of funding for this purpose. But it should be provided to trusted organisations, not UNRWA. In the Indo-Pacific, the level of strategic competition only increases. The goal for Australia is clear: be the partner of choice for nations in the region. That's why the coalition government started the Pacific Step Up in 2018. We have a proud record of achievement in the region. We allocated $1.8 billion of aid to the Pacific in 2022-23, up by more than $700 million on Labor's last year in office. We expanded our diplomatic footprint, becoming the only nation to have diplomatic missions in every country of the Pacific Islands Forum. Our $2 billion Pacific Maritime Security Program delivered 14 of 21 Guardian-class patrol boats, upgraded wharf infrastructure and supported aerial surveillance across the region. And we doubled the Australian infrastructure facility for the Pacific from $1.5 billion to $3 billion. It is vital that we succeed in the Pacific. While Australia has concluded some agreements in recent years, there have been more occasions where nations have chosen a different path. In the past 3 years, China has extended its position in the region with policing arrangements with Vanuatu and Kiribati and a strategic partnership with Cook Islands signed just last month. Multiple agreements have also been signed with the Solomon Islands. And in Timor-Leste, close to our northern borders, the Albanese government was reportedly blindsided by the signing of a comprehensive strategic partnership with China in September 2023. In July last year, China and Timor-Leste announced in a joint statement that they had agreed to enhance cooperation between their military and police forces, including through areas such as joint exercises and training. Nothing is gained by diverting our eyes from these realities. The Pacific and other near neighbours like Timor-Leste must be at the core of Australian foreign policy. In that context, the role of the Quad is important. The Quad was established in 2007 under John Howard with the goal of securing an open, stable and prosperous Indo-Pacific, but it was left to wither under Labor. It was only under the last coalition government that the Quad was restored and elevated to leader-level dialogue with Prime Minister Turnbull, President Trump, Prime Minister Abe and Prime Minister Modi agreeing in 2017 to revive the grouping as a counter to increasing military and diplomatic activity in the Indo-Pacific by China. The Quad complements our regional engagement with ASEAN. It was the coalition government which secured the world's largest free trade agreement, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, alongside our ASEAN partners. The Australian ASEAN Special Summit last year provided continuity in policy engagement with ASEAN nations following the first summit hosted by Malcolm Turnbull as Prime Minister and Julie Bishop as Foreign Minister back in 2018. Nicholas Moore's report, Invested, Australia's Southeast Asia Economic Strategy to 2040, highlights the enormous economic potential for Australia from economic growth across the region. Seizing these opportunities and deepening our engagement with ASEAN is not just about economic benefit. It is of strategic importance as we confront challenges in our region, not least of which is the contest for influence. It is also critical to helping Australia keep our region open and stable with the free shipping channels on which trading relies. Protecting the free movement of goods and people across our region is vital. Recently, we saw the PLA Navy conduct live firing exercises in the Tasman Sea. The government's weak response to this was disturbing, to say the least. On the day of the exercises, the Prime Minister said that notice had been provided. This was not true. As testimony to Senate estimates revealed last week, notification was not provided until after the exercise had commenced. And the Australian government found out about the exercises from a Virgin Airlines pilot. On this issue, the Prime Minister was absolutely all over the shop. While this is not unusual, it is particularly concerning when the stakes are so high. In terms of the exercises themselves, the Prime Minister basically said, "There's nothing to see here." But clearly, there is something to see here. The exercises were not unlawful, but plainly they are concerning. The Chief of the Defence Force described the exercises as irresponsible. The head of the Office of National Intelligence described them as provocative. Why would the government not raise concerns about the exercises themselves? The truth is that the government doesn't want us to talk about the PLA Navy exercises because they are inconvenient for its political narrative. But in diplomacy, as in life, we don't solve problems by pretending they don't exist. We should always be considered and respectful in our dealings with other nations. Few arguments are improved by an increase in volume. We should always be measured. We should always be calm, but we should never be weak. Where is the example in history of weakness leading to success? It doesn't exist. And yet, embracing weakness is the explicit strategy of the Albanese government. The government has made much of China's resumption of more normal trading activities with Australia, and this is welcome. For the coalition, free trade is in our DNA. Analysis of trade policy has, of course, underwritten any number of PhDs and more than a few Nobel Prizes. But at its heart, it is really quite simple. If we impose barriers to trade, we make things more expensive. This increases costs for consumers at home and reduces our ability to sell things overseas. Higher costs for consumers means lower living standards, and reduced opportunities to sell things overseas means fewer job opportunities in Australia. In 2015, the coalition government signed the China-Australia Free Trade Agreement. It had an immense positive impact on our exports to China, which has been good not only for Australia, but also the Chinese economy. With CHAFTA in place, Australian exports to China more than doubled from $86 billion to $189 billion in just 5 years between 2016 and 2021. This huge increase underscores the coalition's success in office on this issue, a key part of which has been our mining exports. Now, the Labor government has gambled with our prosperity and our mining export future through its nature-positive laws. These laws are perhaps better described as mining negative and would reduce our exports to China by billions of dollars. While the government has placed them on hold for now, there is little doubt that they will be back if Labor is successful at the election. We will work hard to grow Australia's trade relationship with China. As Peter Dutton has said, we would like to see trade with China double, but we will never pursue a policy of weakness. When Russia invaded Ukraine, our democratic values demanded that Australia provide strong and immediate support, and that is what the coalition delivered. We moved fast to provide President Zelensky with the Bushmasters he requested. We provided $65 million in humanitarian support. We imposed more than 800 targeted sanctions on individuals in Russia, including Vladimir Putin and his inner circle, and their supporters in other countries. We must continue to support the warriors of Ukraine in this totemic battle. President Zelensky didn't flee when the battle commenced. He stayed to fight and to rally the world against Russia's aggression. We know that the people of Ukraine will never give in, and neither should we. The world must stand with Ukraine in the difficult days ahead. The United States has given much to Ukraine and will be central to any resolution of this conflict. We all want to see peace, but it must be a peace that honours the sacrifices of Ukraine. Because peace without security is no peace at all, and peace without sovereignty is no peace at all. Ukraine is a democracy heroically defending itself against a brutal tyrant. If Ukraine was to fall, what next? It is not hard to draw parallels between the battle that Ukraine faces today and that others may face in the future. The coalition will always stand with Ukraine. I want to say a little about multiculturalism because I believe it is central to our values and has great potential in aiding our foreign policy. When we talk about multiculturalism in Australia, the word sometimes sounds formulaic and hollow. It captures a bureaucratic policy intent, but not the essence of our nation. For me, multicultural Australia is just Australia. It's who we are. I went to schools where only a small minority of kids were from Anglo-Saxon backgrounds. Where your parents were born was not a big deal. I represent one of the most multicultural electorates in Australia and was honoured to serve as Minister for Multicultural Affairs. There's no question that our wide-ranging backgrounds make us a stronger nation. I've noticed that often the people with the greatest pride in Australia are people whose families migrated here. People who fled war or dictatorships or places where they could not be themselves. People who left nations where practicing their religion was a crime. People who love Australia and its values. People who work hard, play by the rules, and create opportunities for the next generation. It's self-evident that some of the greatest Australians are Chinese Australians and Indian Australians, and Australians whose heritage can be tied to every corner of the earth. In foreign policy, we should use the strength of our personal links to every corner of the globe. Few countries boast the cultural reach of Australians. We must do a better job of harnessing the power of these links. Everyday Australians often have powerful insights about events in the countries in which they were raised. And often they have relationships that can assist our nation economically and diplomatically. There is immense opportunity here and is something we'll focus on in a Dutton coalition government. As I said at the beginning, democratic and economic freedom are the greatest forces for good in human history. Maintaining and enhancing Australia's freedoms will be the central focus of foreign policy under a Dutton coalition government. We will work with our partners to secure a stable Indo-Pacific. We will restore our national defence, where there is much to do after Labor's neglect. We will stand up for free trade and free markets. And we will never abandon our democratic allies, as Labor has done so shamefully in the Middle East. We will always be measured, we will always be calm, but we will never be weak. By honouring our values and protecting our interests, a Dutton coalition government will get Australia back on track and restore credibility to our voice on the international stage. Thank you.
Well, many thanks to David Coleman for an important address. So now we come to questions and discussion. I'll lead off. If you just come back up here. Just following on your comment about West Jerusalem. And as you know, West Jerusalem is part of Israel that goes back to 1948. I mean, it's not, as you know, it's not part of the occupied territories or anything like that. So when Prime Minister Morrison made the decision about Australia recognising West Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, which he did at the Sydney Institute, then there was a subsequent decision that this decision stayed, but it wouldn't be implemented until there was some kind of peace settlement between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. So what are you saying tonight? Are you saying that it's a continuation of where the Morrison government ended up, or are you saying a bit more than that?
Yeah, thanks, Gerard. So, look, I think the key point here is to go back to what happened in 2022 when Labor changed the existing coalition government position in an incredibly ham-fisted way. And what we said at the time was we don't agree either with the process, which was appalling, or the substance of the decision, and we continued to view West Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. That continues to be our view. And what we're saying is that we would consult on that in government in an orderly and professional fashion, that we would talk to our agencies, that we would talk with community groups, we would talk with the government of Israel. So it is consistent with our previous approach.
Thank you. Very good speech, and great to hear about moral clarity and defending our foreign policy from a position of our values. I wonder if you could comment about a difficult area for all governments, and that is how to handle the human rights challenges in China. You've mentioned with Russia sanctions against some of the bad people there. I wonder if you have a similar position on China, given the treatment of the Uyghurs and other dissidents.
So, speaking with clarity on human rights issues is very important. We did that in government. We would continue to do that should we be successful in returning to government. I think you don't gain anything by avoiding the difficult issues. You need to be frank. But we're not proposing any specific changes in relation to policy in that area.
Gary Donovan, David. Papua New Guinea and Australia is their largest donor to Papua New Guinea aid. The US has just cancelled over $50 million of aid projects directly to PNG that are already halfway implemented. Would a coalition government step in to either urge the US to lift those embargoes or, in fact, step up?
Yeah, no, thank you, Gary. So we spend about $5 billion a year on foreign aid today, and it's very important. It's important in a humanitarian sense. It's the right thing to do, and it's also important in a strategic sense, especially in the Pacific. So I think it's very much the case that one can make a compelling argument for foreign aid investment in the Pacific. As I said during the speech, we very substantially increased our foreign aid investment in the Pacific whilst we were in government. We've expressed support for various initiatives that the government has taken during this time. Some of those initiatives might be things you would describe as traditional foreign aid, and some of them might be areas of more strategic collaboration that enable us to build those people-to-people links and relationships. In terms of the US withdrawal from much of the existing foreign aid program, that is plainly a significant issue. The US is only a relatively small minority of overall aid spending in the Pacific. Australia is a much larger player, but it certainly is a relevant factor, and we all want to see strong relationships in the Pacific. We all want Australia to be the partner of choice, and a good aid program is part of that.
In recent times, you've made some fairly in my view, well-received comments on the United Nations. If the United Nations continues in, my view and many others, its relative intransigence to improving its modus operandi in many areas and decisions, is it possible a coalition government would start to withdraw its support for the United Nations?
So would a coalition government withdraw its support from the United Nations?
Yeah, look, we're not contemplating that, but what must actually happen is the UN needs to lift its game. I mean, on any objective analysis, the UN is not meeting its key performance indicators, so to speak. The first thing in the Charter, in Chapter 1, is about international peace and security. And, plainly, there are many parts of the world where that is not the case. We see these examples of, condemnation of nations that are democracies that have a far better record, to be frank, than many of the nations that are condemning them. And we need to be honest about that. And we need to take a look at its operations and not be shy about calling out those failings. The foundation of the UN was obviously a very admirable thing, and if you read the Charter, its goals are admirable, but we've got to be honest about it, and we've got to have the intellectual horsepower to really, really get stuck into the detail and use our voice to improve the UN as much as we can.
Thank you, David. In the last year, as I understand it, the Australian government declined a request to join a convoy of Western nations in the Red Sea to combat the Houthis. Yeah. And the ostensible reason for doing so was that it was too far away and we had priorities closer to home. In the last week or so, Prime Minister Albanese has at least contemplated that he might put boots on the ground, Australian boots on the ground, in the context of a peacekeeping force in Ukraine, despite the fact there is as yet no peace in that country. Your leader, Peter Dutton,
Okay, got to be brief. Okay.
Yeah. My broader question is, to what extent should Australia's foreign policy and related defence policy be prioritising our area, the Indo-Pacific, if you like, as compared to conflicts further abroad?
Look, I think it's self-evident that the Indo-Pacific has to be our number one priority. It's our backyard, and it is where there are a lot of strategic issues and a lot of strategic competition. But that doesn't mean that we can't do the right thing and support democracies under attack like Ukraine. And the total expenditure from Australia now is about $1.5 billion. We kicked that off in the period while we were still in government, and that was absolutely the right thing to do. We don't think Australians on the ground in Ukraine is appropriate. We think that that is a task for Europe to be primarily focused on, but we absolutely support continuing investment and support in Ukraine. We have been critical of the government on a number of occasions related to Ukraine. They didn't send coal when coal was requested. They didn't send some helicopters that were requested. And perhaps most inexplicably of all, our embassy in Ukraine was closed for 3 years, even though scores and scores of other countries had managed to reopen their embassy. And so I think that was a failure of leadership on our part. So very strong support for Ukraine, but we don't think that Australia should have troops on the ground there.
Hello, Michaela Browning. And a couple of questions, one on energy and one on trade. They're related. Can you hear me, Gerard? So on energy, energy is obviously very important for Australia's national and economic security, but also for the region's economic security and to key partners like Japan. What would you do differently, or how might you think differently on energy policy for Australia in that regard? And you talked about free trade. What would you expect you would be able to do if returned to government in the face of a review of Australia's trade position vis-a-vis the United States?
Sure.
If there were questions not just about the trade balance, but the behind the border issues.
Sure. Okay, so look, just to take trade with the United States first. So the facts here are quite clear. So in relation to aluminium and steel tariffs, the proposal today is very similar to the proposal in 2018. So what did we do? We marshalled the facts and the arguments to bolster Australia's position, and we did so very successfully. The facts are actually even stronger in favour of Australia's position today, principally because of the increased investment in US defence infrastructure, which obviously is something that is important, understandably, to the US. So we should get this deal done on the exemptions. We want it to be done. We will welcome it if it occurs. Obviously, the deadline is approaching, but we certainly hope that the government is successful, and we think objectively they should be. In relation to energy policy, of course, it has very significant security implications, not only for our partners, but for ourselves. And so we have to always look at energy in the context of what are Australia's requirements, what are our partners' requirements, but our ultimate and most crucial responsibility, of course, is to Australia. So absolutely, it's a crucial area, and Ted O'Brien, who is our energy spokesperson, is doing a lot of very good work in that area.
Thank you very much for coming. My name is Wesley. I'm a resident of the Georges River electorate.
Oh, welcome.
So thank you for coming. Just an observation. I've seen quite a few videos, YouTube, of people being interviewed in Palestine or Palestinian territory, Israel, and I'm wondering how much the grassroots actually want a two-party solution. I feel that many want a one-state solution, but it's either going to be Israel or Palestine, but not both. And I think that would need to be tested in some sort of referendum, but I actually have grave concerns that that is actually what the common person wants, based on the videos I've seen. It's a concern. Thank you.
Well, look, and plainly, a two-state solution is a significant way away from where we are today. It's self-evident, and plainly it can't include Hamas and so on. So you're right to observe the complexity, and it's an issue that has evaded resolution for decades. But we believe it remains the most plausible resolution in the medium term. But crucially, and we think this is so obvious as to be self-evident, it can only happen through negotiation. The idea of imposing effectively a border in the absence of negotiation is wrong. And we've seen, over a number of years, whether through the Abraham Accords, whether through the earlier agreements with Egypt and Jordan, that agreements are possible. And we feel that we need to persevere.
Thank you. Well, it's surprising nobody mentions of President Trump, but considering that our relationship with US are very important, considering that US is not that friendly to Canada, to Mexico, to Europe, to Ukraine, despite they are old allies of US, considering also that our representation in Washington, D.C. isn't very effective. Could you say a few words about how do you propose to manage our relationship with US?
Sure. Look, I think, Sev, the most important thing, and I said this in an interview the other day, is outcomes and the substance. Now, there'll be things that happen from time to time that we might not agree with. Some of those will be so significant that we need to say so. But obviously being a commentator on daily activities from the US is not a smart thing to do and not in Australia's interests. So we focus on substance. And the substance is that the relationship is very much in our interest, and it's very much in the United States' interest. And it's been like that for many decades. We're in a very strategic part of the world. We have incredibly close historic links in so many conflicts. We have so many people-to-people links. It's manifestly in the best interest of both of our countries to continue on with what's been an extraordinarily successful partnership. And of course, it continues to be underpinned by ANZUS and now by AUKUS. We will, on occasion, say that we disagree with something that President Trump has said, and as you would expect us to. And we did that in relation to the comments on Ukraine and on President Zelensky. Ukraine's a democracy. Russia invaded Ukraine. Ukraine didn't invade anyone. And we will from time to time disagree. But what we should focus on is the outcome and working in a constructive way as we always have in the past. And I'm very confident we can do that.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I totally agree with your comments on the importance of values in foreign policy. My question is, given the fact that, as we all know from the media, various ethnic groups from one side or the other may wish to, shall I put it this way, flex their electoral muscle in an election, how do you avoid our foreign policy being in any way affected by the electoral interests or loyalties of a specific ethnic group?
Well, I think that's an easy one to answer. You do what's right. You do what's in our national interests. And the conduct of the ALP in relation to the Middle East, I think, is the exact example of what not to do. Because what's happened there is they've said, we're worried we're going to lose seats to the Greens. The Greens has a particularly a particular position in relation to the Middle East. And so the Labor Party has basically said, all right, well, we need to shift a position that has been held on a bipartisan basis for more than 2 decades in order to protect votes at the Brunswick South polling booth in Melbourne. That's what they've done. And it is shameful. And I think also that the average Australian is smarter than that and sees through that and realises that it's wrong in principle and that it is beneath the dignity of a good government. So you just focus on the substance. And there may be time from time to time where that means that some people in some communities disagree with a substantive policy decision. That's okay. It's a democracy and it will happen sometimes. But losing sight of the fundamental question of what is right in the pursuit of a few votes in a few seats is shameful, it is disgraceful, and I think the government should be condemned for it.
You've got to be brief.
How do you think there is any point in Australia joining the UN Security Council or the Human Rights Council these days? It has been criticised in the past as, sort of being ineffective.
Yeah, like I said before, I mean, I think with the UN we should be working to improve it, and the best way to do that is to be active. So we should be honest, we shouldn't pretend that all is perfect with the UN, because it's far from that, but we should engage and we should seek to improve the institution.
So we've got a Zoom question here from South Australia, which is, if you happen to become Foreign Minister after the election, which I suppose it means if you win the election, assuming you will be Foreign Minister if you win, but if you did that, what would your first visit be in view of the fact that first visits from foreign ministers these days are taken rather seriously in Australia?
Yeah. Well, look, as I said before, the Indo-Pacific is our home. It is our number one priority, and certainly I would be very keen to get to as many Pacific nations as possible. Of course, Indonesia and Japan, I think, would be a number of very high priorities to get to within the first 100 days.
Hey, I'm Josh. You were talking a lot about, I guess, the Indo-Pacific region, and I would have guessed our deterrence is pretty important. I guess because we're such a small country in terms of population, is that really kind of doable without nuclear weapons, with the massive increase in proliferation of them in other countries and other large, I guess, population countries?
Well, look, what we should be doing is increasing our conventional defence capabilities, as we will, now augmented in a very significant way by AUKUS. We don't invest enough today in defence, is the bottom line, and the Labor government has done a poor job of investing in our defence industrial base. So there's two elements. One is invest more in defence in a smarter way, so not spending for spending's sake, spending in a smarter way. And two is working closely with our allies and partners to create a secure and stable Indo-Pacific. And that is through our traditional alliance with the United States. It's with working collaboratively with other nations through the Quad, through the Pacific. But that is what the focus should be.
Final question, following up on an earlier one. If you assume you win, if you came back in a year's time, what would you think your achievements, what would you hope you will be able to tell us your achievements were?
Look, I think the first thing that I would like to be able to do is to have restored a values-based approach to our foreign policy, because I think the government has trashed that. And I think that it's important that Australians know that values govern how we engage in the world. So I think that's important. I think the other thing that's very important is to be frank with the Australian people. And as I said in the speech, I think there have been numerous occasions recently where there are inconvenient truths for the government in our foreign policy situation in the Indo-Pacific. We should not divert our eyes from that. We should be honest about that, because you cannot address a problem that you refuse to acknowledge. So a restoration of our reputation, a restoration of honesty in working and dealing with the broader public, and a very strong focus on stability in our region, on doing more in the Pacific and related areas to improve the safety and security of Australia. Right.
So it's a hot night, so I'll be very brief. Many thanks to David Coleman for a very important address. It's foreign policy these days is a very important portfolio, and it's a very important shadow portfolio. And today you've taken us through the gamut of the policy that the coalition's looking at, giving us some ideas what might happen in the future. So we'd love to have you back next year sometime, but for the moment, well done and thank you.
Thanks, Jeff.